As the description said, this session we wanted to talk about the mechanisms and motivations behind the erasure of women's history and women's stories over time, and looking at both past and present strategies for reclaiming them. And I think this is really relevant right now. Partly, it's really lovely to be here on sort of what's an anniversary of the first conference on violence, abuse and women's citizenship held in Brighton in 1996. But I also think if we're thinking about relevance to today, I think some of the protests we see about the fact that we're even gathering here are to do with the fact that people don't get the correct stories about what feminists are doing, what feminists believe, what we're organising for, and there's so much misrepresentation and so many stories get passed down and so many images get passed around that don't represent what we are doing and what we're organising for, and it means we end up having to repeat ourselves so many times. My name is Victoria Smith, and I'm the author of Hags and one called Unkind, and I'm particularly interested in ageism and motherhood and the ways and mental health and the body and kind of intersections with feminism. I'm really delighted to be joined by Onjali Raúf, who's a multi-award-winning author, and also joined by Susanna, Rustin, who is she's a social affairs journalist at The Guardian, which I think is very important to have very brave voice there, and I think it's one way of getting the stories about feminism that we want to hear throughout the media. And she's also the author of Sex, a radical retelling of the history of feminism in Britain. So we're going to start by each of us just giving a little bit of our own perspectives on women's history and our interests and what we think kind of has happened, and then open up a discussion with ourselves and also with the audience about this. So I suppose my starting point for an interest in women's history, and of which feminist history is obviously an essential part, was kind of actually wondering whether women have done anything whatsoever. Because, this is a sentiment from Caitlin Moran's 2011 book, How to Be a Woman. And it basically says, this is a direct quote from it, women have basically done fuck all for the last 100,000 years. Come on, let's admit it. Let's stop exhaustingly pretending that there is a parallel history of women being victorious and creative on an equal with men that's just been comprehensively covered up by the man. And I think when I read this, it kind of really shocked me, but it also bothered me because I think, particularly as someone who was quite a liberal feminist in the 90s, not informed about the second wave, absorbed a lot of misrepresentations. There was a part of me that had felt the same thing, that kind of women of the past, apart from a few exceptions, many of whom I think we see now are being recast as not actually women at all, that most women were too oppressed to have done anything of significance, and that it's only now, conveniently, in my own time, that we're getting to do anything meaningful. So my own background was in German literature, and the vast majority of writers and thinkers that I studied were male. And I did try to sort of dabble in feminism and feminist analysis when I was a postgraduate, but kind of in the late 90s and the environment I was in, it wasn't very fashionable for academic feminism, I suppose, to be very feminist, certainly in the circles that I was in. And the idea of women's history that I absorbed was that it was a kind of special pleading. And one of these terrible second wave missteps, like thinking bodies matter and opposing porn, so, what were they doing? And it was kind of quite embarrassing, as though we were desperately rooting around in the past to find some female humans who had done something of importance, when you could just waffle on about what is a woman anyways instead. And I think there can be a real fear that unless you cut ties with the women who went before you, all you end up doing is proving that women, the old-style dinosaur women, are inferior after all. And obviously second-wave feminism isn't, as I've just characterised it there. So, so much of what women have thought, said, written and achieved gets passed down in a kind of caricature. And it's ironic that even the history of feminists addressing questions of history and legacy gets distorted and simplified. So one of the points I'd like to stress in this session is that these questions have come up before. The reason it keeps happening isn't because earlier feminists didn't notice. And I wanted to mention just a few here. So in her, this is a photo of Dale Spender, so in her 1982 book, Women of Ideas, Dale Spender poses the question, how are women made to disappear? She writes with reference to the first wave, and obviously the whole concept of waves is something we can find questionable in relation to this. It's such a huge movement with so many voices and various voices could have so effectively disappeared within the space of 50 years. What were the implications for the apparently smaller movement of my own time? And I think most of us here will know some of the ways in which the beliefs and actions of generations before us have been erased and distorted. And I think we also see it happening in real time. I see all around me right now, there's an urge to document this particular feminist moment, the kind of things that are happening here, because we see what is said about us and how others have decided to tell our stories and put it in the worst possible light. And I think we know that it matters because how those who come after us see us will shape how they see themselves. Fundamental to patriarchy, writes Spender, is the invisibility of women, the unreal nature of women's experience, the absence of women as a force to be reckoned with. Women are kept in the dark, with the result that every generation must begin virtually at the beginning and start to forge the meanings of women's existence in a patriarchal world, so that every 50 years, women have to reinvent the wheel. I think this image of repetition is one that many feminists have engaged with, and you have this idea of sort of men add stones to the edifice and sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. And these are all, and it's very questionable as a model, that as well, because which men are the ones who are remembered, which men are venerated. But women's history, and so it becomes kind of like women's work, that it's like housework, it's swept away and forgotten and it needs to be built up all over again. I think for me the importance of passing down women's legacies really hit home when I started to consider it, particularly in relation to ageism and generation gaps, because I think these things are quite closely related. There's a photo of Audre Lorde, women are powerful and dangerous, and I think we can all, dangerous in a good way, but in her essay, Age, Race, Class and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, Lorde writes of how the generation gap is an important social tool for any repressive society. If younger members of a community view the older members as contemptible or suspect or excess, they will never be able to join hands and examine the living memories of the community, nor ask the all-important question, why? And this, as the essay title suggests, isn't just relevant to sex, it's relevant to understanding what earlier women have achieved in the face of intersecting oppressions, but also the complicity of some women in the oppression of other women. And if we're not interested in what and why, and instead assume we know better because we're newer, we can be destined to repeat. This kind of, everyone in the past was terrible, we're great, is a thing that can kind of stop us questioning ourselves and our own principles. And the third feminist I wanted to mention was Adrienne Rich. And so I read Of Women Born 40 years after it was published, and it kind of really blew me away, because it was one of these where I thought, I didn't realise that women thought that years ago. I'd grown up with this idea that certain insights were just happening now, and I think that's another really important thing you learn from looking at the stories of women have had these insights about what's going on for years and years and years, and feminist engagement with motherhood, of which A Woman Born is about, is something that isn't passed down. It's part of that. I think we often see it on a kind of micro level, that often when women have children, and I did it, it's kind of this, why did no one tell me about it? And if you're somebody, an older woman, you might be thinking, But we did tell you, it's just people don't listen to mothers. You know, it's kind of the story about what it is like are told, but they're kind of, people aren't receptive to them. And, you know, I certainly grew up thinking that the feminism, maternal feminism and care ethics feminism just wasn't something that I think was very clearly, certainly transmitted in the kind of mainstream image of feminism that I grew up with. And I grew up thinking the feminist objective was kind of liberation from domesticity, and there was nothing more nuanced and contested. And I think this perspective is being used today to kind of promote tradwife ideology. As one example, you know, there's this kind of, oh look, feminists have never bothered about mothers, so you know, you don't need them. But actually, the fact that these narratives were there and this work has been done and these stories are there is really something that women need to know. And I think one of the great things Rich writes about is about the way this kind of forgetting and this avoidance can take place on a very personal level. And she ties like this big idea of women as oppressed and to our own attitudes to the women closest to us, particularly our mothers. And one quote that I think really sticks to me is this: easier by far to hate and reject a mother outright than to see beyond her to the forces acting upon her. But where a mother is hated to the point of matrophobia, there may also be a pull, a deep underlying pull towards her, a dread that if one relaxes one's guard, one will identify with her completely. And I think this is part of what drives the impulse towards writing off women's past, or saying women have done fuck all. You know, it's this. It also drives a flight from the female body, I think, that many younger women have always engaged in. You know, this fear of becoming what we've told women are, sort of passive and insignificant, and not having views and stories that matter. And women have always been anything but that. The final picture that I've got on is one of Adrian Rich and Audre Lorde together, and I wanted to include this because I thought it was nice to show that women's histories and stories, they're also about relationships and the kind of connections they form with one another. But then when I found this picture, I was also like, oh, but I don't know who the other woman is, so maybe I shouldn't include it. But it's actually a writer called Meridel Lescure. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. That's right. Thank you. She was associated with the proletarian literature movement of the 1930s and 40s, and I hadn't heard of her and I hadn't read about her books. You know, I read lots of John Steinbeck when I was at school, but no one mentioned her, and it's kind of, it's just another example of like, why didn't I know about that? Why? And there are always more and more, there's always more and more to find out because these stories are covered up. And so that's kind of image that I wanted to end on. Just that I think it's just really nice to see just women together as well. So. Now, Onjali, you.
There you go, hello, we've got a feminist in here. Hi everyone, my name's Onjali Raúf. You're not 7 years old, so I'm going to introduce myself to you. So I'm a children's author. I get to travel the country and parts of the world talking to children about stories and forgotten stories and issues that I know they're very aware of. And before I begin talking about a range of women that I have learned about in my later life, and I wish I'd known when I was at school, I'm going to just read you a paragraph from Dr. Fern Riddle's book. I don't know if you guys have heard it, Death in 10 Minutes. It's about a suffragette called Kitty Marion, who was part of the bombing raids across the UK, including the bomb that went off in St Paul's Cathedral, in order to get women the vote. So in her first kind of beginning of Kitty's story, she begins, "History is full of secrets, untold lives that have been forgotten as the victors have decided what, and more importantly, who should be remembered. For people like me, the role of a historian is often to act as a gatekeeper. We are conduits between the past and present, supposedly maintaining an unbiased and clinical view of the facts and events that have shaped our nations and our identities. Our written history, taught in schools and universities, the basis for films and television dramas, and the answer to a question in a pub quiz, is an amalgamation of facts, events, and the story historians have wanted to tell you. But a gatekeeper does more than allow stories out. They also keep stories in. So what I wanted to do is kind of roll back the clock, if I may, to a child's version of feminist history. Now, I'm really happy to be in a room full of non-7-year-olds that may remember a time before the internet, before Google, before kind of wider access to the world that we're supposed to have through the internet. And I remembered at school, one of the reasons I write some of the stories I do is because I had so many questions for my teachers in all of my lessons. Whether it was history, whether it was art, whether it was science, whether it was literature, my question was always, where are the women? Because we study Shakespeare, but we never study Aphra Behn. We study Monet, but we never study Berta Morisot. Does everybody know who Berta Morisot is? Yeah. Thank you, that's amazing. Usually I get to get blank stares. So this founder, this female mother of Impressionist art, who nobody knows about, very few exhibitions on her works, very few tales about her life. Where's her film? Where's her story? Why is she not in our art history books? I remember having a debate with my art teacher about, okay, so why do we do Renoir? Why do we do Degas? Why do we do Van Gogh? But where are all the women? Why do we never do women? And I think if you're very lucky in today's school, you might do Frida Kahlo, but that's about it. There's still this massive gap in these women's stories who helped found movements. And when you talk about Berta Morisot, the fact that she exhibited more paintings than Monet and Renoir put together, the fact that she was one of these art, kind of technique painters that the other male painters would have probably stolen from, the fact that she was so famous that she had to go out to the middle of a lake to paint her paintings. Like, it's because she was hounded by everybody. It's just incredible. And there's a very, really famous kind of diary entry of hers, or a letter, sorry, to her sister, where she says Manet, Manet, of course, the painter, who's her brother-in-law, one day came along just as she was about to finish off a painting that she was going to exhibit to one of the kind of Parisian galleries. And he came along and started touching it up. And not just that, but she wrote her letter and he would not stop. So by the time he finished what he saw as perfecting her painting, it was completely and utterly opposite to everything she stood for. So as soon as he left, she destroyed the canvas and began again. So I kind of think that women's story, I know, amazing. And look at her amazing self-portrait. She kind of dresses herself as a general because she's on a march of her own, But I never learned about her. I only found out that when I finally did feminism at university, I found her kind of hidden on a shelf. And of course, I've got Aphra Behn's character kind of portrait there as I'm cheating with just more than one picture on my slides. But I didn't find out until, I didn't find out about her until I was in my 30s and 40s, when Dulwich Picture Gallery finally had an exhibition on her. Never heard of her name. And now I'm on a mission to tell all kids about her, especially the girls in the room who want to paint for a living. And then, of course, there are characters that I kind of grew up knowing about, being someone of Tunisian, Turkish, Yemenish history. So one of those women, of course, is, I'm just going to say it properly because I never do it, Mariam al-Fihri, and her sister, there you go, Fatima al-Fihri. So they were, this is the beautiful portrait on your left. So both of them are credited with creating the first ever university known to humankind in 869 AD. They inherited money from their very rich father, and Fatima's dream was to bring men and women together to talk about theology, mathematics, science, astronomy. And she laid the foundations of men and women coming together in a single space to study together. And it was a template for universities that we know today. But again, who knows her name? Where is she in our history books? Do kids know her name? Does anybody know her name as they grow up learning about how men changed the world largely? And on the side there you have, so I'm just going to pick up the dates because I'm very bad at remembering dates, so forgive me. There you go. For any scientists in the room, you will know that this is Rosalind Franklin. She is pictured there looking through her telescope. And again, I remember having debates with my science teachers in school. Where are the female scientists? Is there anybody that was worthy of the 400-page textbook that I'm studying from for my exams? Why are there no females in there? So I'm just going to go through a timeline of Rosalind Franklin, just to kind of refresh memory for those of you who know about her, and to introduce you, if you don't know about her, to her. So she was at King's College London, and her specialty was X-ray crystallography. In 1952, she captured the picture of the double helix. Photo 51, she called it. After 100 hours of trying to get this photo, she managed to do it. It was an unmistakable signature of the double helix, which a lot of people use as their kind of signature for women in science. They have that as a special badge they wear. So if you fast forward to January 30th, 1953, Maurice Wilkins, so her colleague, quietly shows the photo to James Watson without Franklin's knowledge or permission. Watson is shocked because they've been trying to capture this picture of the helix for many, many years. He sketches it on a newspaper on his way home on the train from Cambridge. And then in their lab, Watson and Crick begin to forge a first paper on Franklin's finding. Now, because she had managed to capture such a clear image, they began to put together their thesis on the measurements of the angles and spacing and dimensions, and within weeks they had their first paper on the DNA. April 25th, 1953, they publish 3 papers on the DNA together. Watson and Crick's model, they called it, and Franklin's experimental proof was used all the way through the paper, and they managed to put one single tiny line in the index saying that the image was stimulated by general knowledge of her data.
Wow.
1962, so just about 8-9 years later, when this image has basically formed our understanding of the DNA, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins, their third partner, are nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Franklin is ignored, and instead she died from ovarian cancer at the age of just 37 before this nomination came to be, and it's thought that it's because she exposed herself to so many x-rays trying to get this picture to us all. And of course her story is one that it has taken a multitude of female scientists trying to dig out the true story of that double helix picture. And still to this day, people don't know Rosalind's name. And I think it was Wilkins who wrote a biography. He called her Rosie in the book, and called her quite a difficult woman to work with. So again, he wrote a book with a double helix called her Rosie, and the truth was, of course, that she was the foundation of all criminology. You know, I have nieces who are now studying biomedicine and criminological kind of all kind of theories, and it's because of her. So again, when I go into schools and I talk to children, and especially girls and boys, about missing histories, these are the kind of stories I want to make sure that they know. And of course, I wrote a book called The Line Above the Door, which is, again, is for 7 to 12-year-olds. So for those of you who may not have heard of it, it features a young girl called Sangeeta, who is looking for stories to do with women of World War II. Because when I was studying World War II in my history classes, again, I was just so confused that this is a world war we're talking about, a global war to end the worst kind of political racism we'd seen up until that point. And where were all the women? Where were all the women as part of the men's war efforts? And I would ask my history teacher again and again and again, watching VE Day videos, watching footage of films that were being made about World War II, where were the women's stories? And again, it wasn't something that I was partial to or found out about until much later. So just to give you one example, I'm sure lots of you know about Noor Inayat Khan now, but Noor Inayat Khan was an Indian spy. She was living here in England. She came over with her family when she was a child. She was very intelligent. She knew 6 languages, an amazing radiographer. Her nickname was Nora Baker or Madeline. And those nicknames were given to her by Winston Churchill himself because of the role that she had played in what she went on to do. She was the first female British radiographer that was sent to France across enemy lines to try and make sure that the UK troops had the right information that they needed to go in and try and defeat the Nazis. She was also the last to obey orders. So when she was ordered to leave France when the Nazis were entering, she refused. She wanted to make sure that all of her colleagues were out, and because of that she was captured, tortured and then executed. Now we would never have heard of her story unless another woman called Shabani Basu, who worked at The Guardian, found a byline in an RAF record relating to a spy called Nora Baker. It took her 17 years to dig out Noor Inayat Khan's full story, another 13 years to have her recognised by the UK government enough to get a blue plaque on the wall in the house that she lived in Bloomsbury, and another 3 years to get a statue in a local park made to her. And it is largely women's stories, women's eradicated stories that are rediscovered by women and then fought for by women to make it back into the history books. And I get so much joy when I see, especially young girls and boys, learning about stories like this and realising that especially for girls and boys who are not a certain skin colour, don't have a certain melanin content in their skin, they are also part of the history that they learn about in the history books where they are missing. And I'm going to end on another phenomenal Indian-British woman called Sophia Dilip-Singh. Does anybody know Anita Anand? She does the Empire podcast with William Dalrymple, phenomenal woman, one of my sheroes. I try and make her into my bestie whenever I see her. So Anita Anand is kind of responsible for bringing out Sophia Dilip-Singh's story. I didn't know about her either until I did my master's in feminism, and I discovered some notes on her. So Sophia Dilip-Singh, for those of you who don't know, was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was the daughter of the young prince from whom the Kohinoor diamond was taken in India. She was brought over, raised in the UK, in a beautiful palace. But when she became 16, 17, 18, she started to ask questions about the state of women in the UK. She became a revolutionary suffragette. She marched across the UK to get women the vote here. She was so revolutionary that she refused to pay her taxes. So she'd write on her tax papers, until I have an equal say in politics, I refuse to pay my taxes. Winston Churchill regarded her as such a pain in the neck because she was linked to the royal family, that he tried to delete her records, as if she never existed. Sophia Dilip-Singh also ran away to India in a kind of, she literally was a stowaway, went to find out what happened to her father's people, her father's kingdom, came back completely disillusioned, of course, and also marched for Indian independence. But she mobilised Indian women who were here, and women of colour who were here, who also marched with Emily Pankhurst and all the other suffragettes that we do know about it, and Kitty Moran, and we don't know them. We never see pictures of them. We don't know their stories. So unless we do, we're not going to be able to do away with the kind of forgetfulness that not just happens on a wider plane of society, but also within the feminist movement itself. If someone looks at me and thinks, okay, she's got brown skin, she's got a scarf in her head, which must mean a million other things, and she eats a different way, her parents sound a different way, she comes from a different part of the world, but she has no link with me, my argument is, you don't know the links I have with you. I don't know the links I have with you. Until I discover it for myself and start to share the stories and make sure the gatekeepers open the gates, we will not be able to unite in the way that men so easily do, even though they're on different political spectrums, to unite against us, as we heard earlier today. Run home and tell my mum that I've got a little bit of a so in answer to the question that's being forged, how is it that women's histories are so easily forgotten? Easy. We don't have the stories in our books. We don't have them in our lessons. We don't get taught them. And I think that's deliberate. So we have to undo that for our kids. We have to undo that for ourselves. And once we are able to undo it, then we will become unstoppable in ways that the men don't even see coming. So that's what I have to say.
Hello everyone, I'm Rachel Hewitt and I'm a historian and a life writer, and I come at this question with an interest really in sort of drilling down into the mechanics of gatekeeping. You know, how does it happen? that records pertaining to women are sidelined to such an extent that someone like Caitlin Moran can say in what date was How to Be a Woman?
2011.
Like 2011, like women have done fuck all for tens of thousands of years. So I'm sort of interested in the way in which a lot of history writing is dependent on a written record, and how women's lives have gone unrecorded by that written record. So there are ways in which archival documents just don't record women. Up until the early 80s, a woman's income was declared on her husband's tax return. We lose so much detail about women's lives and work that women weren't doing fuck all, that women obviously change names often when they're married, remarried, and are often just recorded by their surname. So it's actually very difficult to tell in archives whether you're looking at a woman's actions, a woman's records, or her husband's. But then there are also questions that are about, real life people making decisions about which documents are seen as most worthwhile and most important to preserve. And, this might be when someone dies, that there are, lots of letters and accounts left behind. Who makes the decision about whether to take them to the local car boot sale or the local tip, or to preserve them into a library? Could you put the first slide up? So these are some of the people who make those decisions. So this is the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography's editorial board, all of whom are male, and who has never had a female editor. And 87% of the entries in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography pertain to men's lives. Now, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, it's quite difficult to sort of kind of overstate how important it is to historians and life writers. It is often like my first port of call. It's a repository of short biographical entries. Actually, not all of them are short. Some of them are really, really long. And they're of British subjects who are no longer living, who are considered by the editorial board to have lives that are relevant to the public good, basically. And obviously that is a very subjective question. Who decides whose life is publicly important? Traditionally it has been defined as pertaining to political change. But that's, women couldn't stand as politicians or as jury members or as local councillors, until the sort of early to mid 20th century. So, but women birth the public, right? But that's not seen as having public relevance. The editorial board, to give them their credits, have declared an intention to try and boost the number of female entries. And the way they've done this is to start looking at the wives of male writers. So I'm sort of interested in, these kind of discussions, which, it's not accident. It's not that just a group of sort of benign men have sort of just forgotten to preserve women's documents over history. It's that there have been conscious decisions made that, that women have done fuck all, which is sidelining the very real work that women have done. Could you move on to the next slide? Thanks. So the arena in which I'm kind of particularly interested in this in my most recent book is sport. And I came to the field of the history of women's sport with a belief that was kind of fostered by doing a bit of cursory Googling and discovering blogs that said, women didn't run before 1972. That's a real quote. An academic historian of sport, his chapter on, he had one chapter on women in sport, over 12 chapters on men in sport. And his chapter on women in sport began with the line, women's role in sport has been that of handkerchief fluttering spectators. And the chapter was about 3 pages long. So I sort of came to this field of the history of women's sport with this kind of, I don't know, vague belief that sort of women were completely inactive until 1972, where suddenly something must have happened to kind of make them put on some male trainers and go for a jog. And then, like, while I was doing this sort of early Googling, I came across these albums of extraordinary photographs of women in the 1880s participating in just a vast array of sports. So Sophia Dilip-Singh was a very enthusiastic hockey player and competed nationally. Found images of women playing ice hockey in Switzerland. The image on the top right is a woman careering at 75 miles an hour down a headfirst toboggan run. Women mountaineering, making all these sort of, you know, extraordinary and kind of dangerous, like, first ascents of mountains. Women playing tennis in international competitions. And I was sort of like, what's going on? You know, how do I reconcile this narrative, well, these images, with the narrative that women were completely inactive until 1972? And, you know, the answer is absolutely one of male gatekeeping writ large. And I sort of realised that what had happened is, over the second half of the 19th century, sport took on this new national importance that was seen and sort of commandeered by men and male public schools and male universities, and sport was seen as the kind of ideal training ground to create imperial servants. And so, you know, sport prior to the 19th century had been far more sort of improvised and ad hoc. You know, sort of village games of cricket, where, you know, women were really prominent in cricket. Apparently, overarm bowling was devised by women in the 18th century because underarm bowling, their hands got caught in their skirts. So, you know, women were there very much and very active in sport, you know, right from the beginning of sport. But in the sort of second half of the 19th century, sport becomes organised. You know, it sort of becomes, men devise all these rules and regulations and set up clubs and facilities and set up all these mechanisms by which world records can be recorded and disseminated. And all of these institutions that are responsible for this organisation of sport gradually become male only. And there is a sort of very noticeable shift in roughly, well, sort of between 1880 and about 1930, where sports that were once kind of happily mixed sex, the women are driven out. So Wimbledon, for the sort of latter decades of the 19th century, have female matches as well as male matches. They have mixed sex matches. But in 1906, make the decision that women's matches will no longer be accommodated. The Swiss Alpine Club, where a lot of female mountaineers just felt, you know, so at home and respected, they make a decision to kick women out in 1908. So there's this kind of reversal, or this sort of clamping down, I suppose, on and the kind of commandeering of the male identity of sport, the commandeering of sport for men. And what happens is that, you know, women are still playing sport, they don't stop, but if their achievements aren't being recorded and disseminated in newspapers and aren't being stored in the archives of, you know, sporting clubs' archives are hugely extensive, you know, they're really kind of geeky about it. But, you know, but women's results aren't there for this kind of really long period of history. And so when women kind of buoyed up by the second wave in the sort of 60s and 70s, start sort of fighting kind of slightly more militantly, but also being listened to a bit more about sort of women's participation in sport, there becomes this sort of narrative that, oh, this is the first time you've taken part in sport. You know, that this early history is kind of completely forgotten. Could you move on to the next slide? And I just want to sort of emphasise that, you know, that this question of the erasure of women from history, it's not a sort of dry matter of kind of academic history. You know, I think it's a question that is about power and control, and it's about who has their sort of, who deserves equal space and place in the public sphere. And I think, you know, sport is that really magnified, you know, because of the sort of nationalist importance that's often imbued in sport. And so actually there's a huge amount of violence, both rhetorical and literal, that accompanies men's attempts to drive women out of sport. So this is an image of protests in 1897 against women taking degrees at the University of Cambridge. And the image of a woman that the male undergraduate students are choosing to hang publicly and to deface is not a female don, but a female sportsperson, a cyclist. And cycling, you know, at the sort of end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century was really both a metaphor and a reality of sort of female emancipation. And we have the final slide. This is an image of Catherine Switzer in 1967 at the Boston Marathon. Boston Marathon was then all male. She entered it under her initials, so it was assumed that she was a man. And this is her being assaulted by Jock Semple, who is one of the race directors. And so, yeah, I just sort of want to end, I think, by sort of emphasising that this question isn't one that is kind of confined to academia. You know, it's a question that is about power and male violence and about the right to equal space in the public sphere.
I think this one. So I'm just going to, since I'm last, I'm going to just say before I start, it's wonderful for us that there's such a big hall full of women. So thank you all so much for coming. So I absolutely don't think that when feminist academics started to write and talk about gender rather than sex, which, as you probably all know, started in the 70s and became consolidated in the 1990s, when the discipline of women's studies that had been invented by the women's liberation movement became replaced by gender studies, that they intended to overwrite or bury women's history. On the contrary, gender was seen as a new tool, a more sophisticated way of thinking and talking about roles and socialisation. I know this firsthand. My aunt, Catherine, was a feminist historian for whom gender was a really crucial term when she wrote a book in the 80s which challenged the conventional wisdom about middle-class Victorian women having been lived their lives exclusively in the sphere of the home. But one of the reasons why I started work on my own book about 3 years ago was that I think a kind of veil falling over women's history was one consequence of this shift. The frame created by gender, which was part of a wider Foucault-influenced emphasis on discourse across the humanities and then into sort of culture more widely, turned out to be an awkward fit with a more empirical, materialist approach to the history of women. So questions like what did women do or think or why at any given time or place came to seem boring and unsexy compared with endless variations on the subversion of identity and transgression of boundaries. So I think the idea we're discussing today, that the history of women has been overlooked because human societies are mostly organised along patriarchal lines, just became to seem a bit boring and old hat. Much more recently, political transactivism has become actively hostile to women's rights and the history of women's rights, understood as sex-based rights, because they know that sex-based rights are in conflict with the trans activist wish to overwrite biological sex with self-identified gender. And I think this is a real problem for the way that women's history is thought about today. I also think it's sort of easier than it should have been, in a way, for some of this relegation of the reality of women's material lives to take place, because gender activists weren't the only ones who were quite relieved to sort of stop talking about sex. There's the famous quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the US when she was making arguments to the Supreme Court about sex discrimination, that the judges were just a bit squeamish about talking about sex, and therefore gender was a useful sort of euphemism. And I think that a sort of discomfort around sexual difference is quite widespread, and that includes, for feminists as well, thinking about, particularly comes up in relation to male violence and all the ways in which women's role in reproduction influences their lives and is important for the way that societies are organised. That might sound a bit sort of abstract, sort of about terminology, gender and sex rather than history, but I'll just give one example of how I think it sort of real life consequence and how it plays out now. I wonder if some of you know that next month is the 50th anniversary of the Sex Discrimination Act, which got royal assent in November 1975. It's an absolutely huge moment in the history of women's rights. It was also in 1975 that the Equal Pay Act came into force, because although it was passed a few years before that, they gave employers a few years to get used to it. And the Equal Opportunities Commission was also created at the same time to sort of oversee it. And it may be that this, is going to be marked, this seminal anniversary, but I just have the feeling that because this is explicitly a law against sex discrimination, and that this is where the single-sex exceptions in the Equality Act originally come from, that it doesn't attract the same degree of sort of general cultural, political celebration as other civil rights anniversaries. I've got 4 slides to show you, which I'll do now. They're all old-fashioned, rather old-fashioned looking white women, although not all middle class. I've just been reading Victoria Bateman's book, Economica, which is a global history of, economic history of women. And honestly, it made me think that, not only is a women's histories erased, but a lot of them haven't even been written, or at least in such a way as to be accessible to, non-academic, non-specialist readers in English. There's any number of sort of extraordinary sounding women from Mesopotamia to ancient Peru, the Indus Valley, so it was fascinating. So anyway, this feels a bit parochial by contrast, sort of mostly Victorian England, but anyway, that's what I've been writing about and thinking about, so here they go. So here's the first one. So I think this painting of Barbara Bodichon is owned by Girton College, which she co-founded as one of the first women's university colleges, and it was included in a recent show at the Tate. She's not completely obscure, but nor is she anything like a household name, but she was an absolute linchpin of Victorian women's rights campaigns, at the centre of a group of women who advocated for girls' education, employment, and married women's property rights, and the first wave of campaigning for the vote, starting in around 1850. I think the reason she isn't better known are quite complicated, partly because she was a collegiate person who did most of her activism as part of the collective. She also thought her French name was a problem, which relates to what Rachel was saying. She also became French by nationality when she married a Frenchman, because that's what happened then. If you married, then you took the nationality of your husband. So in order to make her part of the history of British feminism, you sort of have to reclaim her first. There isn't even a plaque at the building that was her group's headquarters, just off Oxford Street, although there is one across the road marking a dinner attended by Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, next slide, please. So this is Josephine Butler, who is famous, pretty famous, although sadly not as famous as Judith Butler. She's the leader of the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act, which were laws introduced in the 1860s, ostensibly to control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, but which gave police powers to inspect the genitals of any woman who they thought might be a prostitute, and to imprison her if she was infected. Butler wasn't a campaigner against prostitution as such. She was really critical of the criminalisation of women, but there was a moral and a Christian dimension to her activism, and this is pretty unfashionable today. I think since the 1970s, it's fair to say that liberals have generally been more worried about the harms caused by sexual repression and double standards than by the harms caused by male sexual entitlement. Josephine Butler was an incredibly brave campaigner, physically brave as well as sort of morally brave, and pioneered some of the techniques that would be picked up by the suffragettes, but not a great poster girl in a sort of age that valorizes sexual freedom and liberation above many other things. So this is a group photo of some of the first, it's not all of them, but the first Labour women MPs. And this is a group who were elected in 1929, and I just included it because I think it's so great. It's got, so Jenny Lee is at the front, bottom right. Ellen Wilkinson is next to her in the sort of light-coloured dress, and next to her is Margaret Bonfield, who was the first female cabinet minister and grew up in deep poverty in rural Somerset in a sort of cottage lit by candlelight, and went from there to be a sort of apprentice dressmaker in Brighton, and from there to Labour politics. And then next to her, in the sort of shiny dress, is Susan Lawrence, who was one of the first 3 women elected to Parliament for Labour, but really a pretty obscure person, I think, who most people wouldn't recognise. And I just included this because it's such a great example of a visual source. Again, echoing what Rachel was saying about what's recorded and what isn't. There are loads of photos of Nancy Astor because she was so grand and rich, but there's no equivalent sort of group photo of the first Tory women MPs or of the first Liberal women MPs, or indeed a sort of cross-party photo of the first group of women MPs. Jenny Lee, in later life, became quite dismissive of feminism, but I just think this photo, a priceless photo, just shows how important it is to record these moments and achievements when they're happening. And finally, Eleanor Rathbone is one of my all-time heroes, who was rescued from greater obscurity by an American biographer, Susan Pennison, who wrote a fantastic book about her. She was one of the most important women's suffrage campaigners, although nowhere near the most celebrated, and the only one who went on to a career in Parliament. She's also the architect of family allowances, otherwise known as child benefit, which is what is on her blue plaque in Tufton Street, which is obviously a really good example of a policy rooted in a grasp of sex differences and why they're important. She understood that mothers needed specific provision in the social security system if they weren't to be sort of alarmingly dependent on men. And she later on, as an MP, became a really important voice in Parliament on foreign affairs and against fascism. I think one of the reasons that she's not better known is because she was an independent. She wasn't a Labour MP or a Liberal, although she usually voted with Labour. So there's been no institution with an interest in commemorating her in the way that, I think the Labour Party is quite proud of Barbara Castle and so on. And I think perhaps she should be on the wall in the Treasury. She was certainly more important feminist economics thinker than Ellen Wilkinson, who is on the wall in the Treasury, although Ellen Wilkinson is celebrated rightly for other reasons. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was all really interesting. I think the picture of the Labour MPs, that made me think of when pictures. In recent years, we've had pictures of female MP groupings, but labelled the Blair Babes and the Cameron Cuties. And I was just thinking about the way in which, when it's happened in my lifetime, it's been kind of owned by men, even when women are kind of. Which made me think of. I find it the touching up of the painting just it's such a metaphor for kind of I mean it's a literal thing, but it's kind of just for what men have done to women's stories and women's creations and like covering it up. And I think it's kind of and what I think comes through really powerfully in what you were talking about as well, Rachel, was just this I think I used to have this idea that it was kind of people had just got women wrong. It was a kind of misconception, and once it was explained that women could do all these things, then we'd be allowed to do them. But actually, women's exclusion and women's removal from spheres has been very conscious and very deliberate, and it's not been based on a misconception that we couldn't thrive in them. And I think sometimes we fear being seen almost as feminists as conspiracy theorists. Like, I've often said, like, I don't think the patriarchy is like a group of men in a room literally deciding to exclude women. Actually, sometimes it is. Happening. And I just wanted to, you touched on Charlie with just writing stories. Like, what are the ways we can do to combat this? Because it keeps happening generation after generation. So.
I think the ODNB needs some female editors. I think it requires a kind of detailed awareness of the mechanisms by which women are excluded from historical archives or historiography. And that's not just sort of technical material questions, such as the photographer for all those sports photographs. She was called Lizzie LeBlond, and when she died, her late husband's new wife took all of her archives to the local car boot sale. And so they're now kind of scattered around the world as the result of sort of just random people buying them at a Welsh car boot sale in the 1930s. But so it's not just a question of those sort of material ways in which kind of papers and images pertaining to women are scattered or binned. It's also, I think, about the values that are attached to the question of kind of worth, of like, why would we tell this woman's story? Why would we preserve her achievements? And I think that requires rewriting that sort of traditional, sort of Victorian concept of public worth, which I think history is, or sort of, the kind of history that's embodied by the ODNB is kind of slightly in thrall to. So I think it's a matter of sort of bringing these mechanisms into the light, and yes, actually getting over our squeamishness about sort of thinking about patriarchy as, yes, sometimes it is a group of men literally making decisions to exclude women, and sort of, bringing that to light. Yeah.
I agree with everything you said. I also think that it's ironic to me because when you think about the book world and publishing and novels, who made money from it first? It was women who kind of led the way, and then men were like, oh, wait a minute, these romantic novels that all these women are buying by the billions, that's making them money, let's get in on this. And then suddenly it kind of gets overtaken by this kind of view of literature, what's worthy as literature, what's kind of seen as a novella, and who's worthy of telling a story. But I really think, going back to what I was saying, I think it's not just men, it's also us as women actively making sure that we preserve the stories. We are the story preservers. Oral history is the reason why so many of us have these stories to begin with. Just speaking as someone who's kind of the matriarchal arm of my family, like, so many of my ancestral stories are not recorded. They were burnt on purpose. We're never going to have them. I can't do a version of Who Do You Think You Are, because there's no records of who I was and who my ancestors was. But I do have them through the stories that my great grandmother, the records that we kept within the family. So making sure that we make space to value each other's stories and to make sure that then we can work together as women to counter what the men have done to us is really important. And I don't think we're there yet. We're kind of awakening to the fact that there's millions of stories that we haven't heard about, and that are creating kind of rifts. The negation is creating rifts within the movement. But I think the fact that we're here talking about so many ways in which history has been, relayed for us, how women have been spoken for, how the touched up paintings are the ones that make it in, but the others don't. And we can undo all of that through sharing and also making sure our kids know that this isn't the full story, and heck, go out and find out what it is, please. So, yeah.
Can I just add something to that quickly, which is that I think it's also about relentlessly documenting what we're doing now, and not taking, never ever taking like women's public presence for granted. All of those sportswomen in the 1880s and 1890s, you know, they would never have believed that there would become a time where someone might say in an academic history, women have never played sport, you know, women didn't run before 1972. And I think that's what's so important about seeing this erasure as conscious backlash against women's achievements. You know, it's not an accident, you know, and we're all vulnerable potentially to it. You know, so even if, you know, we might sort of feel safe in women's achievements being kind of well known and recorded now, I don't think we can ever be that complacent. It's, you know, we need to kind of relentlessly document and make sure that documentation is catalogued, you know, so make sure that access to it is available.
It's maybe just worth saying that obviously the history of women and the history of feminism is not the same thing at all. There's always been anti-feminist and unfeminist women, and one of the things I got quite interested in when I was doing my research was the anti-suffragist women, one of whom, Catherine Stewart Granger, went on to become a Tory MP, having opposed women's suffrage, but then became a very brave, from the Tory benches, a really brave anti-fascist up to the Second World War. People have such interesting, you know, trajectories. But I just wanted to say as well that one of the things it's important to remember, I love that quote from Virginia Woolf about thinking back through our mothers, if we are women, which can obviously be taken sort of literally in a sort of familial sense, but also in a more public sense. And feminists have absolutely always understood that it was important to have a history of feminism and a history of women, which are, you know, not always the same thing but are connected. And just a couple of examples. So Josephine Butler, who I showed you, wrote a book about Catherine of Siena, the sort of 14th century, you know, mystic. And Mary Wollstonecraft, there was, you know, a long time a sort of conventional wisdom that she'd been, you know, made completely verboten, that she couldn't barely be mentioned for a whole century because her ideas were so radical, and her ideas were extremely radical. But but her flame was also kind of kept alive, and there's some wonderful examples in the sort of 1840s of women who were involved in the revolutions in other European countries, you know, who saw her as a kind of, you know, figurehead and a sort of flame to keep burning. And then Millicent Fawcett became quite a chronicler. She wrote her own sort of, not a dictionary of national biography, but a kind of collection of lives of, you know, sort of women that she thought were important. And then Ray Strachey's book about the women's movement, published in the 1920s, was the first time that Florence Nightingale's absolutely enraged essay, Cassandra, about the sort of Victorian, you know, growing up as a sort of oppressed Victorian young woman, was published. So there's this wonderful sort of historiography, I guess, of feminist history as well as the history itself, which is quite inspiring, I think, because it just really reminds you to sort of, just reminds you that there's been this consciousness of the need to have a sort of narrative, which I think it's really important to sort of hold on to.